All right. Should be touching my face. Hello, class. How are you doing? Hope everybody's doing okay, healthy, staying inside. Anyways, let's move on to chapter 8. This is the medieval period. Basically, the chapter is broken down into two types of religions, uh, philosophical clerics, uh, the Christian side and then the Muslim. Actually, three sides: the Muslim and then the Jewish side. Uh, so basically, the last time we left off at last lecture, where we actually talked about philosophy, was the Hellenistic era, and the Hellenistic era was all about everything Greek. Uh, Pretty much spearheaded by the conquest of Alexander the Great of the known world during that time period. So as Alexander the Great moved eastward and northward and southward, everywhere, he spread his belief in Greek philosophy, culture, you know, law, you name it, everything Greek. And that's what Hellenistic means. Where Hellenic is Greek proper, Greek itself. Hellenistic is something like Greek, but not Greek. Remember that Alexander the Great is Macedonian, and he's not from Athens or from Sparta or from the Greek mainland or the Greek Isles. He is not Greek. He wants to be Greek. He loves Greeks, right? He emulates everything Greek, and he spreads that idea. Um, so that happens. However, he dies. Remember, I talked about how he dies just after a couple of days of partying really hard, uh, and it kind of goes into shambles. The whole unity that he created, this whole Hellenistic world, kind of dissolves. Uh, we have the fire of Alexandria. I think I mentioned that before. We are split for break for this long extended break that we have now. And basically, what happens is that this culture, this Hellenistic culture, fades away as this Hellenistic world, right? This unity that Alexander was trying to create, this empire, Macedonian world empire he was creating, dissolves. And I mentioned about the couple of generals that keep their own areas for themselves. And it creates constant warfare between these generals and their successors, their sons and grandsons and great grandsons. Um, but the one thing that does happen during this time, when the Greek Hellenistic influence fades away, is actually that Christianity spreads, becomes a big thing. The rise of Christianity uh, is one of the most, according to the textbook here, the most powerful trend through this time period. So Stoicism, Epicureanism, uh, and these Neoplatonism, all these Hellenistic philosophies. I mean, there's still people that adhere to that, people that still practice that, but it's not as trendy, it's not as popular anymore. Now Christianity takes the helm as the main framework to explain the world and the universe. So this is what we call medieval philosophy, and it's kind of sad because during most say probably 20 years ago, 50 years ago, we take a philosophy class, you won't be talking about medieval philosophy. Uh, Most philosophers agreed. There was a consensus back then uh, that there was nothing worthy philosophically. That it was all Christian. It was all theistic. That it was all based on belief. So here's a good part to break and talk about the difference between what we call philosophy of religion. So this was the stance that these people were taking, that religion has no philosophy, but now there is a whole field called philosophy of religion, and then theology. Right? So theo means God, Logiology, right, is the study of. So the study of God. So what is the difference between philosophy and religion? Philosophy of religion and theology. What is the difference between those two approaches? These two right here. Well, the first thing is that in theology, you take God, theo, uh, as an assumption. It's already granted to you. You don't question, in other words, right? You don't question the existence of God. God already exists under the framework of theology. On the philosophy of religion, that is not an assumption you can make. Right? You could question the existence of God. And actually, that is the main central issue or question in philosophy of religion. Does God exist? It's supposed to be a question mark. Um, so that's a big difference between there, right? So for a long time, people were just dismissing medieval philosophy, what we call medieval philosophy now, as just merely just theology, hence not worthy to be in philosophical textbooks. Now we take an way different approach and realize that these people, these theologians, were actually heavily involved and influenced by philosophy. So let's take a look at at these particular people. So this medieval period is a perfect transition from going from the ancient world, right, the Greeks, the Romans, the Macedonians, and now into the modern world, which will be chapter 9, be Descartes. We'll begin with Descartes. There's that transitional period between that. So instead of just saying that, oh, it's just dark ages, nobody was thinking. It was all about beliefs, Christian beliefs. Now we're using the medieval ages, not as the dark ages, it's the medieval period, right, between, right, it's the midpoint between the ancient and the modern period. Okay. So let's talk about one of the most impactful theologians during the medieval period. I'm talking about Christian theologians here. So the first one, and you might argue that this guy is not even from the medieval period. This guy is late antiquity, late ancient period. Is Saint Augustine of Hippos. Saint Augustine. Let me see. Let me put it. Where's the so excuse me. Saint Augustine was around 354 to 430 CE. So he passed away in 430 CE. And the reason why he's so important is because there we go, there we go. He's one of the theologians, he's Christian theologians, or one of the first ones at least, to blend Plato and Aristotle. Right? He was able to access, he would still have access to Plato and Aristotle. So remember, one of the main reasons why we go into Christian mode, full Christian mode, is because most of us totally lose access to these ancient Greek texts. Uh, Basically, very few texts survive, and they're in Latin, and most people don't know how to read Latin or Greek. The only people that know how to read Latin or Greek are monks and church officials, right? The Pope. So they have this monopoly on this power, right? And that's why they're also so powerful. There was this time period. And then on the other side of the world, the Muslims have access. You know, they're the ones that have truly access to Aristotle and to Plato and to Socrates. But in the Western world, it's only just the high church officials that have access to these texts. And these textbooks are in Latin, right, or Greek. Right? Again, none the masses don't have access to these great thinkers. Saint Augustine does. So Saint Augustine uh, blends Plato and Aristotle, their philosophies, and he also blends it with Christian thought, Christian beliefs. So he's kind of like the transition point between the Greco-pagan period and what we call I lost my little whatever, I don't need that. the Greco-pagan. So paganism, you don't. There's no Christian God. There's no monotheism. It's a bunch of gods. It's more naturalistic, animalistic. Right. This is what people were doing when they hang around in Stonehenge. Right. These pagans praying to the sun and to the winds and to the earth and the sky and stuff like that. So St. Augustine is like this transition point, this pivot point between the Greco-pagan period and the Christianity, Christian thinking. This transition that would totally change the world, basically. So he was like one of those pivot points, these important thinkers. Uh, a good point about an important fact about Saint Augustine is that in most depictions of him, he's white. You know, I have his book here. Right, he's depicted as white. He's this guy here. Right, he's got a white complexion, even pink cheeks. But he was born in North Africa, in Algeria. Right, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, native North Africans are not white. Right, they're right smack in the equator. Right, the sun is beating them, 24/7 pretty much. So at least the whitest would be like me, which is brown. Right. So most people argue that Saint Augustine he's a black folk, he's a black man, which is totally kind of goes against most of the official narrative of Saint Augustine. But he was born in Rome in North Africa in Algeria. Uh, his mom was a Christian a lady. His father was a pagan. So that's why he's like that pivot point between paganism and Christian thinking. Right, and in this book, The Confessions, right, well, so he writes a whole bunch of important books. He's a prolific writer. Uh, he's trained in rhetoric at Carthage. He's exposed to Cicero. Cicero is one of these Hellenistic thinkers. Cicero. These Roman thinkers. He's a really important guy. And he's also exposed right there in Carthage to this philosophy kind of religion called Manichaeism. And the importance of Cicero, the significance of Cicero, is that he's all about Aristotle and Plato, right? So that's how he gets access to Aristotle and Plato, St. Augustine, via Cicero. Manichaeism, well, maybe I should just use the keyboard here. Oh man, what happened? Manichaeism. That philosophy or this belief is that there's always this eternal battle between evil and goodness. That evil exists and goodness exists, and the world, the whole universe is just this eternal battle between those two. And we're just kind of like a proxy. We're just kind of like agents of that battle, right? So the world is not like ruled by this whole all-knowing God. It's ruled by this big eternal battle of good and bad. Okay. So in 383, he goes to Rome, and then there, of course, he's exposed to Christianity, and he's impressed by Christianity, specifically by the sermons of his bishop. Uh, his name is Saint Ambrose, and he's a bishop from Milan. Which, if you've been keeping up with the news, Milan was heavily hit with this whole coronavirus. But Saint Ambrose of Milan, just very fiery speeches, and he's totally convinced Saint Augustine to convert to Christianity from Manichaeism, and he does. Was it in 383? At age 31, Saint Ambrose personally baptized Saint Augustine on Easter Day. He becomes Christian. Soon enough, Saint Augustine he goes back. Actually, goes back to Algeria, to Africa, to Hippo, which is now the city of Annaba in Algeria, Anyways, he goes there and he becomes the bishop of Hippo. Becomes like the main priest, the leader of the church of that city, Christian church of that city. So remember that North Africa is right now is controlled by the Romans. So he writes a whole bunch of books. Confessions is the most famous one here. Uh, it's kind of long, about 300 pages, but it's really good. It's a really interesting read. Basically, it's like an autobiography. At the same time, there's meditation on philosophy and Christian beliefs. So basically, for the most part of the book, it's all about the sins he's making as a young kid. All these sinning he's doing, right? He talks about all these crazy thoughts he has about breast, stuff like that. One of the most I think interesting passages that stuck to me was when he was a kid. He goes to a neighbor's house. Well, he's walking down the street, uh, right there in Algeria, and his neighbor is really stingy. He's kind of wealthy, and he has a beautiful peach tree in the backyard. And he goes and steals the peaches because his family is starving. Saint Augustine. So Saint Augustine, without the neighbor knowing, goes and steals some really delicious peaches that he has to go and feed his family who is starving, and his little sister and whatever, his little baby sister. And he's talking about, like, is that a wrong thing to do? Was that a sin? Like, who is the sinner here? Right? And if we were in actual class, I would break up here and ask you, right, if what St. Augustine did, steal from a rich person to feed his family, a sin. Is it a right thing to do? Is it wrong? Is it good or is it bad? Right? You could argue that the rich guy, this wealthy guy, I forgot his name, like this neighbor, he worked hard for this peach tree. So why should Augustine, who hasn't worked, he's a kid, he's just a troublemaker, why should he get, get scot free off of this thing, right, without punishment from God or from the authorities? Right? And this kind of reflects what's going on right now, right? A lot of people are saying that, Jeff Bezos and these big CEOs that, haven't paid taxes should help the American families out that are out of jobs because there's no restaurants or there's nowhere to work at right now because of this pandemic, right? And some people argue, it's like, why? If these people worked hard for that money, why should they give it out, right? So these questions, these philosophical questions, are really pertinent, not just back then, but to this day too, right? So St. Augustine Confessions, it's a pretty interesting book if you ever do have the chance to read this, or if you like this stuff, philosophy, which I'm sure hope you do. Let's move on. So basically, he's a big dude. If you want to talk about this Neoplatonism, which is this merging of Platonic beliefs, specifically the Plato's theory of the forms. So remember that theory of the forms. There's two worlds, right? The world of the forms, and then the world. Excuse me, this coffee. And then the world of the physical. Whereas the world of the forms is perfect, eternal, blah blah blah, and the physical is right the shadow world, right? The think about the allegory of the cave, right? So metaphysics, right, of Plato's metaphysics here, the world, the theory of the forms. So the Neoplatonism, sorry, merges that theory of the forms um, with Christianity, basically, or with this other non-materialist or religious ideas. Okay, so it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be Christianity. It could be maybe some other kind of religious idea, whatever. It could be Islam, right, or Judaism, as we'll see later on. So this is what Neoplatonism, and just neo just means basically new, right? So, for example, I will call myself a neo-Marxist because I use a lot, right? The way I analyze the world is via a Marxist lens, but not the traditional Marxist lens. I use a more updated, I guess you could say, version, where instead of just focusing on the economics, where Marxists did, I focus also on culture and art and stuff like that, that I also think is very, very important. Anyways, let's go back to St. Augustine. So he writes a bunch of important books. Confessions, definitely my favorite one from his. He writes this other really important book called City of God. And this one is exactly, this is a perfect example of Neoplatonism, of this merging between classical philosophy and Christianity. And there's other books that he writes, but those are the two most important ones. So let's talk about his actual philosophy. All right, let's keep going. So he has this. So he's all about how to explain Christian beliefs using reason. He finds no contradiction between philosophy and religion, between reason and belief. He finds he thinks he could marry those things, reconcile those things together. Uh, and he has this notion of the necessary truth. Necessary truth. So a necessary truth, and he uses this to come to God's existence, right? To an argument of why God exists. Um, so a necessary truth is just basically this: a truth that could not that needs to be necessary, that cannot be false. It's something that has to be true. It cannot be otherwise. Um, so he's right here. He's attacking the skeptics, right? The skeptics that don't either believe in God or don't believe in that we can find truth, right? Skepticism. So he's saying that, you know what, like, no, there is truth out there. And he begins with this argument that's very akin to what Descartes will use later on about uh, I am, therefore I know. Cogito ergo sum. So this is what St. Augustine says a couple hundred years before Descartes. If I am mistaken, I exist. If I am mistaken, right, that there's no truth out there, then I could say for sure that I exist then. I can for sure claim that I exist if I am mistaken. Right? If I'm mistaken with that proposition that there is truth, that I am making a mistake then, if you're right, skeptics, then I can say that I exist then at least. That's a truth. That's the truth right there. Does that make sense? Right? A non-existent is this again, St. Augustine. If I am mistaken, I exist. A non-existent being cannot be mistaken. Right? If you don't exist, you cannot be mistaken. You just don't exist. Right? Therefore, I must exist if I am mistaken. Okay, so my direct experience, right, is for sure something that is true, at least just to me, but it's at least true. And there is some truth out there somewhere. Right? That's kind of like where he begins here, this necessary truth, right? And then he also talks about mathematical and logical truths, right? These what he calls evaluative truth. Evaluative truths. So what are these? So these are things that you can just evaluate your own thinking by your own self. 3 plus 7 equals 10. 2 plus 2 equals 4. Right? 1 plus 1 equals 2. Right? You don't have to go outside. You don't have to experience 1 and 1 again to then get to experience 2. You don't have to go there, right? You just know 1 plus 1 equals 2. Triangles have 3 sides. Right? You don't have to go outside in the world and look at a triangle and count 1, 2. Oh yeah, it does have 3 sides. We just know this, right? These are just logical, mathematical truths, and that we could just evaluate on our own. This is what Augustine calls evaluative truths. These are timeless, right? These are necessary, immutable, right? These kind of norms, right? Again, right? He's being here influenced by Plato, right? These are necessary truths, and then there's also contingent truths, right? Truth that might not be necessary. And from here, from these necessary truths, right? There's got to be for him. There's only one absolute necessary truth. There's kind of like a hierarchy of truths, a hierarchy of being. That's what we call it now, right? Just like Plato has kind of like this hierarchy. right, of the forms, and the form of the good being the highest of the all forms. Right? There's a form of table, there's a form of a book, right, out there in the world of the forms, but the form of the good is way better than the form of the book or the table or the cup of coffee or whatever, right? It's the same thing with Saint Augustine, right? He's heavily influenced by Plato again. By this, right, the highest necessary truth, then, it's got to be God. He's the most immutable, the most timeless, the most necessary. He's the highest, the best of things. He's the sinneth, the top of everything. Therefore, God exists because he is a necessary truth. He is at the top of the hierarchy of beings. There's a great chain of beings. He is at the top of the top. Right? For example, there's books. I mean, maybe there's tables and there's books, and then there's animals and humans, or maybe there's upside down. It depends on your view. Right? If you think animals are better than humans, people sometimes do think that. Anyways, and then there's angels, and then there's God. It's a great chain of being. This is the way St. Augustine is looking at it. In this framework that he's using to justify the existence of God, this hierarchy of beings is totally based on Plato. And then St. Augustine also dabbles with this awesome topic that we still deal with in contemporary philosophy of what we call the problem. I'm going to write like a little kid. The problem of evil. I think my daughter writes better than this. The problem of evil. And this is an O. This is part of the B here. PRO. Problem of evil. So, right, some of these skeptics are like, okay, God is all good, so why the fuck does evil exist then, St. Augustine? How do you explain that to me? Right, St. Augustine is like, oh yeah, I mean, you got this all wrong, dude. You got this all wrong, right? God is all good. He's absolute goodness, right? He did not create evil. God is incapable of creating evil because he's all benevolent. He's all good. But evil does exist. And why does evil exist? Is because God gave us free will. Right? God gave us free will. Everything that God gave us is all good. But he gave us this free will. That free will itself is all good. It's just what we do with it. How we use it is what creates evil. So humans create evil. It's not God. God is all good. He's incapable of creating evil. It is what we do with that goodness that he gave us. Right? So he sees us that there's no evil in there, right? He's going against, again, not just against the skeptics, but now he's returning against his old belief of Manichaeism. This belief of that the world is set up, the universe is this constant battle between God versus evil, right? Which is not the case for him. The case is that there is no evil. All there is privation of good. Everything is good. What you perceive as evil is the lack of goodness. The lack of goodness is what we think is evil. That's what he thinks, right? What St. Augustine is saying. There is no evil because God created everything and God is incapable of creating evil. The evil that we see is us turning away from the goodness that he created in God, in the world, that God created in the world. So evil, the moral evil, we call moral evil, is just the privation of good. All right, and this is what he says. Let me bust out with St. Augustine because I have access. Kind of nice about online teaching is that I have my fucking library here, right? As you can see it. And there's another one on the other side with more books. There's more books everywhere here, so I love it. So yeah, so this is what Augustine says. It's just really short. Hear me, O God, how wicked are the sins of man. The sins of man. Right? Men say this, and you pity them, because you made man, but you did not make sin in him. Right? You did not make sin in him. He sins. Man sins with its own free will, but you did not make sin in him. Okay, so let's move on. from St. Augustine. Let's move on a couple hundred years forward, about 400 years forward, to St. Anselm. Let's put St. Anselm. So this guy also has an argument for the existence of God, which is a little bit more, I guess, complex. I want to say he's a little bit more complex than St. Augustine. So St. Anselm, he was the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is basically like present-day London in England. He was a really smart kid, really smart. But let's go to his actual argument. I'm going to give you his fucking background. It's kind of boring. He's not as interesting as Augustine or as Aquinas. Right, but he creates this, what we call the ontological argument for the existence of God. The ontological argument for the existence of God. So what does ontological mean? Ontological mean is just the definition of a thing, the definition of being. What characters or what properties make a being be? Right? What is being? What is to be? Right? So here is all about the definition of God. What defines God? What makes God be? Right? And according to St. Anselm, the definition of God itself, this definition of God, is going to give you the argument for the existence of God. Right? So it's an argument based upon the very definition of God itself, or himself, or herself, or whatever you want to picture God as. So let me give you a different kind of arguments before I give you their own definitions or their own explanations. So there's the ontological argument for the existence of God. From the ritual theologians right now, right? We're in medieval period. We're trying to prove God existence. So there's the ontological one. There's cosmological. And then there's also apparent design, of what we could call teleological argument for the existence of God. So first, let's go back to the ontological, St. Anselm's. So this is the way his argument goes. He first posits that he first defines God as the greatest possible being. God is the greatest possible being. He is the greatest possible being, right? By definition. And basically, by that definition alone, you come to the conclusion that God exists, right? Suppose that this being, this greatest possible being, only exists in your mind. But then St. Anselm says, like, no, that can't be true, because he has this idea. He makes an assumption here that something is better, right? He makes a hierarchy, right? His value judgment here, that something is more better, I guess, best, I should say. It's terrible grammar. Something is best if it's actual, if it's real, than if it's just in your mind, if it's just a thought. So God can't be just a thought, because by definition, God is the greatest possible being. So God has to be real. That's St. Anselm. You can obviously tell that I'm not totally convinced by this fucking argument, right? I don't know how you are convinced, but people bought this, right? And it's still people kind of use this, to whatever reason, right? Of course, there's a lot of critiques. One of the greatest critiques is that you could use this for anything. You create the greatest possible island and use the same argument, or the greatest, or the God is, what exists? It's not God, but you could say it's the greatest most evil supreme being ever. You could use the same argument, the same logical sequence, the same Austin does, to prove that as well. So you could prove just about anything with this ontological argument. So that's why it's not that convincing. All right. So let's move on to the cosmological argument. All right. Oh my God. What did I do here? The cosmological argument. I was going to write it down, but I can't. Let me see. Fucking thing is acting all crazy here again. Serious. So the whiteboard's not working. Okay. So you just have to listen closely again. The cosmological argument is Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas. It's so bad I can't write this down. Oh my God. Really? Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, Tommy Aquinas. The cosmological argument goes like this. Right? Apparently everything has some kind of design, some kind of telos. Jesus Christ. Fucking Blackbird really fucking sucks. Alright, well, whatever. Wow. Wow. Whatever. Some kind of telos. Telos means endpoint, some kind of goal, some purpose. Even things that seem to lack some kind of knowledge, right? Like a tree. Like a tree doesn't have like knowledge. I guess you could definitely argue that now, right? We could definitely have some experiments and some studies that we could argue that plants do have feelings and have intentions. But back then, right, back in 1274, this is when this guy died, 1274, Aquinas, right? Something like tree, right, it was inanimate, right? Something that apparently lacks knowledge. For example, a sunflower seed, right? It's a beautiful sunflower. There's a sun here, right? Sunflower has a seed, it falls, and by itself has its purpose. What's the purpose of the seed? To create another sunflower, right? The same with everything. Everything seems to have a purpose, whether it has some kind of mind or not. Everything has a telos. And if something doesn't have a mind, like a seed, right, then who's making it direct towards a flower? Who's directing that endpoint? Who's telling the seed to grow and do its thing? Must be God. This is the cosmological argument. Right? The cosmological argument basically just takes some kind of property from the cosmos, right, from the universe, and you say like because this exists, right, somebody must have put it in existence. Look at the way it acts, right? The sun, right, and the planets, right? The planets revolve around the sun and the galaxies, right? Somebody must have put it that way. It didn't do it by itself, right? That's basically the cosmological argument, is that everything has a telos, a purpose. Someone, some supreme being, entity, must give in everything that telos, that purpose, right? And Aquinas proves this in his famous 5 ways, his 5 proofs, right? That the existence of God is based upon, how the universe works. Right. The first, I'll just go over a couple of them. Right, you can read the rest in your textbook. Just kind of running out of time here, going too long here. I'll go on forever and ever here. Apparently, the first one is the argument for motion. Right, it's evident, he says. Right, everything's in motion, everything's in flux. Right, think about the Socratics. Right, that everything's in flux, everything's moving. Right, but something has to put that potential, right? When something is not moving, it has a potential to move, right? And that actuality of moving has to be done by something, by some kind of force, right? So like my hand here is just kind of still. It has a potential to move. Either it could be my brain telling it to move, or it could be like some other force telling it to move, right? And that's for everything, he says, right? In the Summa Theologica, this is the book that he writes, Summa Theologica, right? The sum of all theology. Everything has a movement, right? There's a moved and the mover. Right? Think about Aristotle here. So Aquinas is heavily influenced by Aristotle, whereas St. Augustine is influenced by Plato. St. Anselm and Aquinas are influenced totally by Aristotle. They're Aristotelians. As a matter of fact, St. Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, when you read his books, right, if you read the Summa Theologica, and whenever he's always going to be referred to the philosopher. The philosopher. He never gives you the name of who he is, but it's obvious who he's talking about. It's Aristotle, right? That's the only philosopher he referenced to. There's only one philosopher here for him, for Aquinas. Is the philosopher is Aristotle, right? So Aristotle has the same notion, right, in his metaphysics, right, about the first mover. Same thing for Aquinas. The first mover has to be God, right? He also, from Aristotle, kind of steals the idea, or was influenced by this idea of the efficient cause, the first cause of everything. Everything has a cause and effect. Everything has a cause and effect. But what was the first cause that caused everything, right? That caused everything in the cosmos has to be God. So that's the cosmological argument. This is Aquinas, right? Let's see. His one of his last proofs is actually the teleological argument for the existence of God, right? So he mixes both the cosmological and the teleological. Let me see if I can finally write again with Blackboard. Nope, I can't. All right. Sorry, guys. The teleological argument is also known the argument from design, right? So think about how complex the world is, right? Everything's so complex. Everything seems to have some kind of design, right? So who designed this? Who designed the whole world? Who designed the seed, the sunflower seed, to grow to a beautiful sunflower? Well, who designed the acorn to make it grow into a beautiful oak tree, right? Somebody has to design the whole cosmos, and it must be God, right? This is from here, from this teleological, from this telos, he goes on to his ethics, right? So from the existence of God, we also understand, right, by noticing that nature, by noticing the cosmos, how the universe works, we could also derive how we should comport ourselves, what is right and what is wrong, right? So this is what we call natural law theory. Excuse me. Natural law theory is a moral philosophy, is an ethical philosophy that is based upon the way things are, tells you the way things should be. Right. So again, the acorn, right, when it falls from the tree, from the oak tree, it falls. If you leave it alone, right, it's going to go into the ground. It's going to get rain. It's going to get sun, and it's going to grow into a tree again. Apply this to human beings now, right? To moral philosophy, morality, right? If somebody gets pregnant, if a woman gets pregnant, not just somebody, if a female gets pregnant, right? What's going to be the telos of that, the end point of that, right? You go make a baby, right? That's why, according to St. Aquinas, and he's a Christian, and St. Aquinas is a philosophical backbone of the Roman Catholic Church, which is still very much alive. That's where abortion is deemed as bad for Roman Catholics, because they're based upon this natural law theory. Leave things as they are. Don't mess with God's design, right? You're not God yourself, so why are you going to abort that seed, right? Don't mess with God's design. It has a purpose, and you didn't make that purpose. It was God. This is the argument right here that Aquinas is making, and this Roman church people are making about the pro-life thing. Right? So the way things are, right, the way the nature is said to be, is the way things. The God said it like that. So leave it alone. Right. So these are the right things to do. Is based upon this natural law theory. Right. So obviously the telos for people is to promote good and avoid evil. Right. So that's in a nutshell. But what about when we have conflicting duties? when two duties conflict, right? Say, for example, a woman is pregnant, right? Has a fetus, has a seed in her, but she also has cancer. And if we don't treat her cancer, both of them die. Both the mother and the fetus will die. So what do we do, right? We're a doctor here. We know if we give her chemo, we're going to kill the baby, but we'll save the woman, right? So what do we do here, right? There's conflicting duties here to save a life, to promote the most good, right? So according to Thomas Aquinas, it's a natural law theorist, we have this thing called, this formula called the doctrine of double effect. Basically, what this principle says, what this formula says, is I'll just read it from the textbook here, is that performing a bad action to bring about a good effect is never permissible, but that performing a good action that brings about, sometimes a bad effect, that's permissible. So again, if you perform a bad action to bring about a good effect, that's wrong. But if you perform a good action that the consequence results in a bad effect, that's okay, because your intention was good. So the doctrine of double effect is all about intentionality. What's your direct intention? So here, it will be okay to give the lady chemo because my direct intention is to save the lady. Consequently, the fetus dies. That was not my intention. My intention was just to save the woman, so that will be okay, right? So that's kind of like the doctrine of double effect. You base what is right and wrong when you have these conflicting duties based upon your intentionality, right? The means don't justify the ends, right? Your means have to be always pure and good. The end result, that's kind of out of your control, kind of. Even if you do know that if you give her chemo therapy, then possibly the baby's going to die, right? So the doctrine of double effect. All right. I strongly suggest you guys to keep up the readings, please. This is not enough, right, for what's going to what's on the quizzes and the exams, and really just not enough for you. And talking about not enough, let me go over now. Let's switch gears and go over to the Islamic world, to the Muslim world. Let's talk about Ibn Sina. And it's a shame we can't really write on the blackboard no more, on the blank whiteboard. And I'm really hoping this thing is still recording. All right. So Ibn Sina, or how we know him here in the West as Avicenna. So we're actually going back in time. This is right after St. Augustine. This is around 180 to 1037. And now we're in the Common Era. Right? We're not in the BCE, we're in the CE now. So this guy is a fucking genius. But before I understand why he's such a genius, let's talk about the rise of Islam. Right? We can't understand Avicenna if we don't understand Islam. So Islam basically means, if we translate it, means submission, right? Islam is just this total, complete submission to Allah, to God. Allah equals God. Same word, same concept. As a matter of fact, Islam uses the same prophets from Christianity and from Judaism. So this is the last religion from the book, the Old Testament. Jews and Christians and Muslims, they all believe in the same God. It's just the way that's different is the prophet. Who is the main prophet? Who is the one that has the truth? And according to Muslims, to Islam, it's Muhammad. Muhammad is like the last one that has who got like the most clear and the most pure and the most accurate revelations from God, from Saint Gabriel, actually. Right. So, and this is the Quran. These revelations, which are Quran. The definition of Quran translation, the right translation is recitations. The recitations that Saint Gabriel gave to Muhammad, and he wrote them down into the Quran. The recitations. This is what God said via Saint Gabriel and via Muhammad. Right. This is the Quran. Actually, I have a copy of the Quran. It's a really interesting little book too. So how does this begin? So first it begins with the Bedouins. And I wish I could write this down so you guys can understand what I'm talking about. And no, this is not talking. This is not working. It's just totally just frozen. The Bedouins is these nomadic tribes out in the Arabian Peninsula, desert area, the sand dunes, right? And they just go around and camels, just raiding people, just scraping a living. Um, this guy Muhammad is part of these people. He's in Mecca. He goes to Mecca in 600 CE, 600 Common Era, and he goes to a cave and he meditates. Right, very similar to Buddhism. Right, he goes out to his own place and he meditates for a while. And Saint Gabriel appears to him, and he gives him these recitations, reciting him the word of God. Right, and this is the Quran. So the primacy of God is the main thing for Islam. Submission. This is what Islam means. Submission to God, to Allah. This is what the Quran states here, and one of the first in the first chapter called the cow, the cow. Um, God is forgiving and merciful. Righteousness does not consist in whether you face towards the east or the west. The righteous man is he who believes in God, in the last day, in the angels, in the book, in the prophets. And he, though he loves it dearly, gives away his wealth to kinfolks, to orphans, to the destitute, to the traveler in need, and to beggars, and for the redemption of captives. Right? He who attends his prayers into the levies of alms, right? So it's God. Submission to God is the main thing. Right? So Islam spreads tremendously really quickly. There's dynasties that help spread Islam, kind of via the sword. If you want to say it that way, which is kind of the same way as Christianity spread was via the sword as well, right? Through conquest. So you have the Umayyad Caliphate or dynasty. They controlled Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia. In 636, a couple of years after Muhammad dies, so Muhammad dies in 632. In 636, this Umayyad Caliphate conquers Jerusalem, right, the holiest city of these three religions. In 711, they conquer Spain, and they conquer Spain for a long time, 400 years or so, all the way up to 1492. They conquer Spain. In 1717, they conquer Constantinople. This is the Umayyad. These are Muslims people. These are Islam. In 1732, finally, there's the Battle of Tours, which is in France, right? The Frankish people in Tours. And finally, they defeat the Muslims here, the Umayyads. So that's like the border there. They stop there in France, right? But all the Mediterranean world is now controlled by the Muslims. All the way up to India. In 1708, the Rajas, the Raj, right, the rulers of India, they put a stop to the spread of Islam here, right? So from India all the way to France, that's all Muslim now. Within 50 years of Muhammad's death. Fucking impressive, really. Even you thought Alexander the Great was great. Even this is up there too, right? Pretty impressive, right? This Muslim conquest, supremacy. By 1750, yeah, they kind of subsides this Muslim conquest supremacy, right? What made it? What was the thing that made him so fucking badass, right? It wasn't Muslim. It wasn't being a Muslim, really. It was the fucking camel. The camel right there in the desert could outlast the horses by days, right? Where a horse would die within a day, the camel could last a couple of days without having to drink water, right, or food. Right? So they have the humps in the back, right? They're pretty fucking fast too, right? So the camels, right? Technology in the embodiment of the camel was what made this conquest easy for these Muslim raiders. They were raiders, basically, right? The Bedouins, right? And then the Umayyad Caliphate. And then from the Umayyads, we have the Abbasids Caliphates. Right? They moved their capital from Mecca all the way to Baghdad, Iraq. So Baghdad became the capital of this big, huge fucking empire, this Islamic empire. Right? We get sugar from there, from Baghdad. Right? These people had sugar first, oranges, squash, cucumbers, and then they spread it around. Was it spread around? With the Crusades. The Crusaders came, right? Tried to take over Jerusalem. Went to Baghdad, found fucking sugar. We're like, holy shit, this is good. Put some in my coffee, right? And then that was kind of like how we landed over here in the plantations. And that's where we get slavery, right, from sugar, right? So it's crazy history here that's going on this time period. Also, another thing that made them so badass and conquering people, because these people had banks. These people had like joint stock companies, right, corporations. They were pretty advanced people. That's what I'm kind of trying to get at here. This is the lesson here, that these desert dwellers, these nomadic desert dwellers, within 50 years became super fucking advanced, right? And now we're bombing them, right? We're bombing Afghanistan and Pakistan, and we're saying that they need democracy, they need us, when they have this long history of a beautiful fucking civilization. Um, yeah, they have checks. I mean, the word check, right? When you have a check, when you paycheck, right? The check, that word itself is a Arabic word, right? It means a bills of exchange, right? The concept of a check. You don't have to carry all these coins to go buy yourself a Camel. Now you just have a bill, right? A little piece of paper, a check. That word check is an Arabic word. They invented that system, right? Of banking, right? Investment and trade, right? They're tremendous on that, right? They had paper making, right? They imported that from China, right? They reached China and they were like, wow, these people have paper, books, right? They're very literate, right? These people, right? Primarily, you have to read the Quran, but you were also able to read, the Greeks. We have access to the Greeks too. These people, right? So Al-Azhar in Cairo, the University of Al-Azhar, oldest university in the world. That was built in 975 CE. For example, in Europe, in Western Europe, in our side of the world, the oldest university is the University of Bologna. Bologna, right? That was built in 1088. This is in north of Florence, in Italy. The second oldest university in Western Europe is the University of Paris, right? The Sorbonne. That was built in 1150. The University of Oxford, right? Also a very, very, very fucking old university. One of the oldest in England, for sure. That was built in 1167. This one, the ones that these Muslims people made, was built in 975. Okay? And that University of Al-Azhar in Cairo, it was the model for these other universities I just mentioned, right? Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. So what they were doing in Al-Azhar, Cairo, right? It's pretty close by to Alexandria. Well, they were preserving the textbooks that didn't burn down in the Library of Alexandria. They were preserving these great classical Greek and Roman texts. Right? That's all they did, right? Preserving Greeks and also their old Persian and Egyptian textbooks, right? So Aristotle, for example, was saved from ruins, from oblivion, because of these universities in these Muslims in this Muslim world. Um, so think about this, right? In the University of, for example, in Al-Azhar, Cairo, this university, there's a synthesis of ideas from Persian, Egyptian ideas, and this Greek classical ideas coming together. And that's why we have such amazing geniuses like Avicenna. Or before him, we have this guy named Rhazes or Al-Razi. He was in charge. He was the director of the Baghdad hospital. So they had hospitals back then. Right? By 931 Common Era CE, Baghdad had about 930 licensed physicians, right, doctors, they went to universities and got their licenses and were tested, right, and were examined to become physicians, to become doctors. 930 by 931 CE. Guess how many doctors we had in medieval Europe? We didn't have any. We didn't know about doctors. We had healers and shit like that. No doctors. Right. So this guy Al-Razi, he was a director, the one in charge of the Baghdad hospital, the best hospital in this empire. He wrote about 120 books. All right. Now let's move to Avicenna. This guy is in your textbook. So Avicenna, Ibn Sina. He was heavily influenced by these pre-Socratics, especially Hippocrates. That's where we get the Hippocratic Oath. Right. When you become a doctor, you got to take a Hippocratic Oath of just helping people out, whatever. It's taken from this Avicenna guy, right? Because he uncovered and preserved the writings of Hippocrates and synthesize them with his own upbringing in this Muslim world. Beautiful fucking stuff, Avicenna. His biggest textbook that he wrote like, how many books did he wrote? Over 200 books he wrote by age 20, right? I'm 32, I think, 33. I stopped counting at 30. I haven't written a book. I read an article, a couple of articles, but no book. This fucker wrote an encyclopedia by age 20. He had written an encyclopedia, multi-volume encyclopedia at that. By the age of 16, when he was 16, right? We're thinking about getting drunk and we're thinking about our quinceañeras and sweet 16s, right? Thinking about cars and stuff like that. He was already a doctor, a licensed physician when he was 16. Avicenna. Fucking awesome fucking dude. Avicenna. So what was his significance in the Western world for us? His metaphysics, especially his metaphysics. So what he did here is that he mixed Aristotle, with Neoplatonism and with Islam. These three big things put together, synthesized them, and created this amazing way of thinking. His biggest, influence in the Western world for us, for our philosophy class, is his argument for the existence of the eternal soul, the existence of the soul. So it goes like this. Avicenna tells you, imagine a guy, this man, a flying man, who's suspended in the air. He is deprived of his senses. He cannot sense nothing. But he knows he's out there in the air floating. Thus, he knows he exists. So we don't need a body to exist. We just need a soul. So therefore, the soul exists first, and then the body exists. Right? So a body is not necessary to determine whether we exist or not. And so this is kind of alluding to rationalism, right? This is going against empiricism, that we need to experience things to know that they exist. It's like, no, right? Imagine this flying man. This argument tells you that we don't need to be a body, that we don't need to experience things to know things. Right? This is rationalism in its infancy. Right? Descartes would take this all the way to the next level. This will be the next chapter. He also has a cosmological argument, the same as Aquinas, and this is 100 years before Aquinas. That's even more complex than Aquinas, Avicenna. He has this thing between necessary beings, right? Think about necessary truths, as Aquinas. He has the same thing, necessary beings and contingent beings. I wish I could fucking write, but I can't. No. Oh, come on, don't. There we go. Contingent versus necessary beings. Right? So necessary beings are just beings that have to be, that need to exist. Obviously, God is one of them. And the contingent are ones that could be, that didn't have to exist. That's me and you, right? We didn't have to exist. Our parents didn't have to meet and get it on and us to exist, right? It just happened that way, by chance, basically, right? Not unless there was like a forced marriage somewhere. But besides that, right, it's contingency. It's contingent. It could happen, it could not happen. Right? And this is the way it is, right? Beings, everything in the world is like that until you reach who? Until you reach, right? God, right? Everybody's contingent, right? Your grandparents, they could exist, they could not exist. Thank God they did exist because now we exist. So this hierarchy of contingent beings until you get to God, right at the top, right? So that's Avicenna, right? This difference between necessary and contingent beings in this chain of causes, this chain of hierarchy, this hierarchy of beings. All right, let's move on to the other guy, Maimonides, Moses ben Maimon. And this guy is Jewish, although he was born in Cordoba, Spain. Remember I talked about the conquest of Muslims? Muslims conquered Spain from 711 CE all the way to 1492, which we call the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain, under Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, when they got married. So another thing, what happened in 1492? Anybody know that? What happened in 1492, a really important date for Spanish history? Not only did they reconquer Spain, kick out the Muslims, the Moors, right, Matamoros, so we killed the Moors, but they also discovered America with Christopher Columbus, 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So 1492 is a really important date for Spain. But anyways, Maimonides was living in Spain before 1492. He was living in Spain. He was born in Spain in 1148, right in the middle of Muslim conquest. Cordoba was conquered by the Muslims, and these Muslims were like, you know what? Any non-Muslim, and this guy is Jewish. Maimonides is Jewish. Any non-Muslim either get out or die. So he was exiled from his own home place of Cordoba, Spain. It's a beautiful city. If you ever have a chance to go, gotta go there. And he's super important because of this one book that he wrote, for philosophy at least. Right? He's super important because of this book that he wrote. He's more about he's a rabbinic. He's a rabbi, basically. But he wrote this book called The Guide for the Perplexed. The Guide for the Perplexed. And in this Guide for the Perplexed, this is the way why he's important, because it's about interpretation. He talks about, if you read the book, if you read the Bible or the Quran, or in his case, if you read the Torah, right? This is for the Jewish people. If you read the Torah and you read it literally, right? If you take what's there and you say that's literally what happened, that's the truth, then you're wrong, right? You're not understanding God. God doesn't speak in literal terms, in specific, like direct terms, explicitly. It's all about figurative language, right? If you read the Torah or the Bible or the Quran and you're understanding it like figuratively, right, you get a figurative meaning, right? If you understand it's a metaphor, it's not a real true story, it's a metaphor of something bigger. That's the right way to understand the truth of the Bible. That's the way to derive truth from the Torah or the Quran or the Bible, is by understanding it figuratively, as a metaphor or an allegory, not as the direct truth. Right? And the reason why he says that is because we just lacked, there's no way we could understand God directly. We just lack that knowledge. We gotta use metaphors and allegories and similes, right? Like stuff, right? We gotta use figurative language, right, to understand God. Because there's no way we can understand God directly. This is the guide for the perplexed. That's why people are so perplexed by religion, because we try to understand it literally. They'll say, no. That's the wrong way to interpret the written script. I'm going to go over the last two philosophers of the chapter here. Hildegard of Bingen, female, very famous female theologian, which is kind of unique to that back then, because back then females were not that respected that well, but she was, even though the popes respected her. But what she's important is about mysticism. She was a mystic. Basically, she would get some terrible migraines, and she would have visions about God. In these visions, she would write them down and write books about them. So this Christian mysticism, being a mystic. Right, so, and she wrote about everything. She wrote about ethics. She wrote about music. She was a musician. She was pretty tremendously well read. And the reason why she was well read is because her family gave her up. She was orphanage, and they gave her to the church. And that was one of the ways that women were able to read and become educated, was only via the church. Well, most people back then, you deal with time periods. You want to become educated, you have to go to the church. That's what Christianity had a monopoly on knowledge during the medieval period. Cool thing about Hildegard of Bingen is that she's perhaps the first female to write about the female orgasm. Right, so I won't read it out loud here, but it's pretty cool. I mean, I honestly think it's a kind of like a disappointment, but she writes about how it feels to have an orgasm. Kind of back then, this is really intense stuff, right? So pretty cool stuff. She actually became a pope. I mean, a pope. She actually became a saint in 2012 when Pope Benedict finally gave her sainthood. Right, she was sanctified. All right, the last philosopher, theologian I'm going to talk about here, this philosopher cleric. Oh, he wasn't even a theologian. He was actually against. He was one of the few philosophers that was a critique, that was critical of religion. And this guy is William of Ockham. You might have heard if you're taking like psychology classes or science, right? Occam's razor, right? The principle of parsimony, right? So the principle of parsimony is just this: that you just, if you have two different theories, look for the one that makes the least assumptions. The simpler theory is the one that always going to be more right. Um, entities. This is what supposedly this is what he said. Entities are not supposed to be multiplied beyond necessity. So don't make things harder than they are. Find the simplest explanation for your problem. This is Occam's razor. And again, he was always he was very critical of the church. He was actually excommunicated from the church. He was exiled by the Pope because he got in a fight with the Pope on the argument, on the debate on property. Occam was saying, like, you know what? The church is so wealthy, stupid rich, because they have all this property that never in the scriptures does it talk about that the church is supposed to own property. And the Pope was like, yeah, no, fuck you. Like, I like my bling in my chair in my cathedral. We need property. All right, so he was excommunicated for that. He was very outspoken. Another important thing about him is about the notion between realism and nominalism. I wish I could fucking write, but fucking black. Oh, come on. Here we go. Realism versus nominalism. Basically, it's saying that this is a debate about universals. You probably don't know what universals. The universals exist. Think about Plato's forms, right? These universals that are eternal and timeless and immutable. The universals, the forms. He's saying like they don't exist, right? Um, some people say they do exist, right? For example, most of science deals with universals. When a scientist talks about an electron, he's not talking about a specific electron, right? He's talking about electrons in general. Does that make sense, right? So that's universal, right? When scientists talk about gravity, it's not about a specific event of gravity. It's about gravity in general, right? Universally, right? He's saying that that doesn't exist. This Occam guy, right? What does exist is the name of it, right? We give to these principles, these universal principles, but they themselves don't exist, right? In that issue of realism, or the realist, like Plato says that universals exist independently somewhere out there. They exist. That's still a debate that's going on in philosophy. Um, yeah, I strongly suggest you to read, especially the part of Then and Now, where it says about modern realism about universals, with Bertrand Russell, because it's really important. Right, the universals, do they exist or not? Is it just about particulars, or can we talk about universals and make sense of the world? So that's what Occam opened up for us. All right. So that's the end of this lecture. Took longer than I thought it would. But next time next lecture I'll upload is going to be chapter 9, Descartes. And you guys stay safe, stay at home, and constantly wash your hands. And yeah, goodbye, guys. Thank you for your time.